Hi there, Year 12. So this is Tuesday the 31st psychology lesson, where we're going to be building on some of the work we did last week and moving on to look at something called maternal deprivation, which is something that Bowlby talked about, and we've come across Bowlby a number of times already. So we're going to just make sure we're building on that and looking at another aspect of his theory. But before we plough on with that, bit of feedback on the exam questions that I've received from you. Thanks to those who've sent them through. Those that haven't, I assume that you are keeping on top of this. Please email me or ask if there's anything that you're struggling with. If you're not managing to access any of the materials, I would rather you just tell me and let me know. I wouldn't want you to fall behind. But those ones that I did receive, I've just done similar to what we would normally do in lesson, a bit of feedback. So if I have replied to you and told you which numbers of feedback points to focus on, then that's what these correspond to. So for question 1, and that was asking about that internal working model, it'd be really good if you could try and include the term continuity hypothesis. Remember, that's the idea that our attachment type that we have as an infant with our primary caregiver continues on with us through life. That will just really impress the examiner if you can use terms like that fluently in your answers. For number 2, a couple of people that I looked at had slightly drifted off from the focus of the question. It wanted you to focus on how your attachment type as an infant goes on to affect your childhood. So many of you were right to talk about Myron Wilson and Smith's research on bullying, because bullying is often something that does happen in childhood. But if you started talking about some of the other research like McCarthy or Cohen or Ward, this was more about adulthood, and you needed your answer to be really focused on childhood. So in your textbook, which obviously you've got access to the online textbook, it was the research by somebody called Kearns that's specifically about childhood. So it would definitely be worth having a look at that and just doing a bit of green pen improvement on your answer to number 2. Wherever you can, you should refer to a study which supports the point that you're making. There's obviously loads of different studies that you can refer to. So if you've got a number 3, that's what I'd like you to try and do. And now number 4, at this point, I wouldn't expect anybody to be able to do. But this lesson now, today's lesson, if you like, is looking at Bowlby's maternal deprivation hypothesis or theory, and includes a key study called the 44 juvenile thieves study. And once we reach the end of this lesson and you've got a bit more of an understanding about what that study involved and what the findings show, you'll be able to incorporate that. So that will be a nice kind of end of lesson task to go back to your questions on later life and that you've completed last week, and to see if you can add this new piece of learning into it, because it's another good study to refer to. So make sure you do go back to your questions, add your green pen, make a note of anything that you need to build upon so that you're continually developing your knowledge on those studies. Retrieval task for today then, this is obviously taken from the knowledge organiser, but I've blanked out quite a large number. So we've got some of the key thieves. You'll see Bowlby's 44 juvenile thieves is on there. Obviously I haven't blanked any of that out yet because that's what we're going to be looking at today, but I thought it was useful for you to see that you've got that on your knowledge organiser and you can be using it to help you. But I'd like you to recall as much as you possibly can about Lorenz, about Harlow's monkeys, the method that was used, Schafer and Emerson, fill in those gaps, and Van Ischendum and Cronenberg. And don't forget to read over and think about that evaluation column, because that would be really important if we had extended questions. So give yourself no more than about 5 minutes. Don't use your notes. Either print it out or just jot down your thoughts as previously, and have a go at that as a retrieval task. Okay, so when you've done that and you've given yourself a little bit of time, you can check it against your knowledge organiser. I've put the completed version on the screen here, but obviously you've already got that in your folder anyway. Key things then, remember, I'm always talking about the devil being in the detail. So knowing which type of monkeys, the rhesus monkeys that Harlow used, for example, and being able to give specifics about the Schafer and Emerson study, you know, how many babies were involved, how often they were revisited, what research method was involved in the study, using the proper language like meta-analysis when talking about the vanished and doomed study that we've looked at recently, and not forgetting some of those evaluation points. And when you look at the evaluation points, they are just door frame, aren't they? It's getting us thinking, is it ethical? Is it representative? You know, are we making assumptions? Is it socially sensitive? Does it have real life applications? Has it made a difference to anything? So don't forget the importance of the evaluation. Okay, so moving on, this lesson, our main focus is we're returning to Bowlby, and we know that we remember the features of Bowlby's attachment theory so far with our little acronym SMACCY. So we have our social releases, we have monotrophy, we have the idea that attachment is adaptive, we've adapted to attach to people for our own survival. We have the internal working model that was so important when we were thinking about how it affects our relationships in later life, because it's like that blueprint, that first attachment we form, and we've got the critical period. I did that the wrong way around, didn't I? But this idea that there's a critical period during your early childhood, and within that time you really need to have that strong, stable attachment with your mother. And Bowlby really did focus on the importance of the mother, probably because of the time period when he was researching and when he was coming up with this theory. Our attitudes towards the importance of the role of the father didn't really exist to the same extent back then. So I've put on the screen there a quote that I think just sums it up. And this is really important to kind of remember that this is the context within which Bowlby came up with this idea. He thought that a mother's love in that infancy period and early childhood was as important for a child's mental health as vitamins and proteins, good nutrition were for your physical health. So he really thought that if you didn't have that mother love, then you would be massively disadvantaged and you'd have mental health problems. Now you'll see at the bottom of the screen, and I have attached the PowerPoint on Sims engagement so you can use the link yourself. You'll see there's a link here to simplypsychology.org, and there's some really good notes on there around Bowlby's maternal deprivation hypothesis. There's also a little video clip, so I would recommend going to that link, taking some notes, watching the little video clip, and making sure you get yourself familiar with this idea that Bowlby had. He used the term maternal deprivation. Well, if you think about maternal, that's the mother, and if you think about being deprived of something, that's not having it. Now, Bowlby was referring to people who, yes, they probably had a biological mother. It wasn't always because she had died, but for whatever reason, they were deprived of that. Long periods of separation, extensive periods of separation, and very regular. So your mother's really not around enough to form a strong attachment with her. Okay, so a couple of key terms that you need to be really clear on. This idea of deprivation that I've just mentioned. So if you're deprived of something, you haven't got it. And when Bowlby talked about maternal deprivation, he talked about that separation from prolonged periods of time from your primary attachment figure, and he saw that as being the mother. And he thought that that results in a lack of emotional care. So when we think about that definition of attachment, that reciprocal emotional bond giving emotional security where your needs are being met, Bowlby's saying that if that child doesn't have that from a mother in those early days, infancy and early childhood, then that will have serious implications. And if you jump down to the bit where it talks about effects, he says it's not just on their emotional development and well-being that will be seen. It can actually cause them to have a lower IQ and to have mental health problems. And Bowlby used a term called affectionless psychopathy. And we'll see that in a minute when we focus on his 44 juvenile thieves study. And that sounds horrendous, doesn't it? We talk about psychopaths and we often have this image of sort of murderers and completely unstable people. Bowlby was not suggesting that everybody who doesn't have a mother figure in their early life becomes psychopaths, but he used this phrase because he described people with affectionless psychopathy as having problems with emotions and emotional development and struggling with empathy, being able to put themselves in somebody else's position and understand how somebody might be feeling. And often they did show very unstable characteristics and therefore really struggled with different forms of relationships and generally behaviours. And we will see that when we look at Bowlby's 44 Juvenile Thieves, which is referred to just a little snapshot here, but we're going to take a closer look. So Bowlby's research is very widely read and understood, but over the years, some of what he has said has been misinterpreted and some things have been twisted. And so I thought it would be important to kind of have what Bowlby did say, what the key aspects of his maternal deprivation theory are, versus what he didn't say. So he did say that there is this link between maternal deprivation and affectionless psychopathy, but he didn't think that that happened overnight and easily you suddenly just became this sort of psychopath. And he didn't say that it's inevitable and it's irreversible. So he wasn't putting this kind of stamp on you to say, oh, your mother wasn't around when you were an infant, you're definitely going to end up this way. And sometimes people have misinterpreted what Bowlby said. Now, I think it's still fair to say that Bowlby's theory on maternal deprivation is socially sensitive, puts a great deal of pressure on the role of the mother. It has implications for things like whether the mother should return to work, and return to her employment. So it is okay to make the evaluation point that this is socially sensitive, but I wouldn't go as far as to say that he said it was inevitable, because that's not quite true. He did say that children are biologically biased to form an attachment to the person looking after them, and that they'll do so even if that person abuses them. And that's quite significant, as when we see that, we see infants that form attachments with parents where there's abuse and cruelty. It's because, Bowlby would argue, it's because it's innate. Remember that word, you're born with it, it's built into you, and you'll do it for your own survival. So you'll form an attachment with somebody who's looking after you or supposed to be looking after you for your own survival, even though they might not be doing a very good or kind job of it. And I suppose that's a bit like what we saw with Lorenz and the imprinting. It probably wasn't in their best interest to form an attachment with a human being, considering they were goslings, but they did, and that became their blueprint, and that was for their survival. Bowlby did say that if mothers leave their young children for long parts of the day, that what's really important is that there's an alternative good quality care in which the children can experience those positive attachments. So he didn't say mothers should never go out to work and you can't ever leave your child, but he did say that that child needs to be with somebody consistent, a grandparent, for example, and they need to form those strong attachments. He did say that a considerable proportion of children who are the victims of deprivation in their early lives do go on to have perfectly comfortable and acceptable lives, and they avoid the delinquency that he was talking about and the damage. And he estimates that about 25% of them would suffer irreparable damage, as he calls it, and that means going on to be deviant, to be involved in crime, to suffer educationally, emotionally. So that's quite a significant proportion, but he's not suggesting it's everybody, and that's important for us to keep in mind. But he does think that even if those risks are low, we should do all we can to avoid it. And so for Bowlby, the role of the mother in those early years and in that critical period, which he said was the first 30 months of life, was so important. Okay, so it's not as clear-cut as if you experience maternal deprivation, you'll definitely be a delinquent, you'll be deviant, you'll have all these problems. But he did think it was a significant risk and one that we should try to mitigate against. So we need to really dig a bit deeper into this study. Bowlby's 44 Juvenile Thieves study is one of those that's specified on the exam spec, which means you've got to know it inside out. So it's one of those where I say the devil is in the detail. Now this link here, the Tutor to You website, which I would recommend, it's an excellent website for lots and lots of different resources. If you go to that link, you'll see a document or a summary that looks a bit like this. And this is a little bit more detail than what the textbook gives you about Bowlby's 44 Juvenile Thieves study. And you'll see the findings summarised as well. So go to that website, pay close attention, and when you've read through it, what I would suggest you do is another strategy that I just want to share with you, when you are, for example, when you watch that video clip that I referred to you earlier, where Bowlby's talking about his theory, or when you're looking at the study in detail, if you're making some notes, this strategy here, it's called Cornell Notes, and it's really useful. So you would just jot down your notes on the left-hand side as you normally would, but then what you do is you just create yourself a margin on the right-hand side, and in the margin all you do is you just put one word or one little memory trigger that's going to help you to remember and to summarize all of the notes that you've just written. And it's useful because you can then come back to it and use it as a retrieval task where you fold over your piece of paper and all you look at is your trigger words on your right hand side, and you then have to recall as many details as possible from the left hand side. So I wanted to just provide you with that template because you might find it useful, and it can be used for any subject obviously and for any task. Okay, so one more video clip to watch here, and again use the Cornell Notes strategy that I've just shared with you here as you're watching to take your freehand notes, and then you can condense it and pick out your trigger words. So use the video clip link here on the PowerPoint, which is obviously being shared through Sims engagement, and just have a little watch. This focuses on the methodology, that's the research method that Bowlby used in this study. So how did he carry it out and what did he find? And it's a nice little summary. So to conclude this lesson, check your understanding and try and do this without looking. Obviously it's not yet in your long-term memory, but it's just a good little check at the end of today's lesson. What did Bowlby mean by affectionless psychopathy? So that's a new key term for us. We might create a flashcard for that. What's the difference between just separation and deprivation? What does Bowlby mean by the critical period, and try and remember how long he says that is? And what is maternal deprivation? And how does that support the idea of the internal working model? So let's try and blend together the different aspects of Bowlby's theory here, because they all do link. And then coming back to the beginning of this lesson, what I suggested when I gave you your feedback to your questions on later life and how attachment type influences us in later life, can you now use Bowlby's 44 Juvenile Thieves study to support your answer, probably for question number 1, where you can now make that link because that would be impressive to the examiner. Okay, so that's it for today. Once you've watched all those video clips, taken those notes and done those quick check your understanding questions, you'll be very much up to speed. I'll be posting tomorrow's lesson on as well, and then towards the end of the week I'm going to set you kind of not an assessment, but like a quiz, for a multiple choice quiz, using forms whereby you can just check your understanding and see where the gaps in your knowledge are. So keep checking Sims engagement, keep looking on the YouTube channel for the next instalment. Okay, have a good few days, guys.